Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 7th meeting. Special evening for us. The guest speaker we have tonight is someone I've hoped to bring to Keele World Affairs for many years. He was globetrotting as the chief executive of Oxfam, so we decided that it would be unkind to ask him to come along. He's, as you've seen from his biography, he's an incredible person, holding on many, many roles from a very early age. And of course, particular interest to an audience like ours, a citizen group like ours. He is all about citizenship and about our rights as citizens. And I think one of the expressions I've used that as chief executive of the New Economics Foundation, that is an organization that promotes justice. That's social, economic, and environmental justice for all. And that's a topic that comes back to at Keele World Affairs time and time again. I'd just like to mention briefly that Danny, please, if you wouldn't mind, go and see him at the book desk before you immerse yourself in your coffee, and that helps us get the flow going at the book desk. Nantwich are kindly here again for Danny's impressive book, Power to the People. Use your voice, change the world. So if that's what you want to do, I think you need Danny's book to help you. But without further ado, please welcome Dr. Danny Sriskandarajah.
Thank you so much, Bill, and good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've heard a lot about you all and Keele World Affairs, and I'm really delighted to be here. And the more I find out about you, the more impressed I've become. And so I know tonight is about me trying to tell you about citizen action, people power, and to tell you a bit about what's in my book. But I want to start with you. And yesterday I was looking at your website, and I want to read something that's on there. Founded in 1980, with the support of Keele University, over 1,000 meetings later, and with over 500 members, we are regarded as Europe's largest continuing educational initiative in international politics. Keele World Affairs is a registered charity with trustees whose role is to ensure that it fulfills charitable aims of its constitution. Its operating activities are run on a voluntary basis by trustees and many other members, including those mentioned on this page. Thus, it is a privilege to welcome a wide range of distinguished speakers to each annual series of 20 or more Thursday evening meetings. Many members of the House of Lords and Commons speak here, along with ambassadors, academics, and even a Sri Lankan-born Australian who has a ridiculous idea that this could be the century of the citizen. And that is what I want to talk to you about. But I began with those words from your website because I really only want to make 3 points this evening. And the first of those is that people power, citizen action, is incredibly important, it's incredibly precious, and I would argue it's fundamental to humanity, and we should celebrate it. We talk so much about the state, the government, the budget, taxes. We talk so much about business and whether shares are up or down, or if a company is in profit or not. But as a society, we talk so infrequently about what's often sort of rather derisively called the third sector: civil society, voluntary organizations, charities, non-profits, community organizations, community interest companies, what makes up what I would call civil society. And I think there's a problem here, that society, particularly in the West or in the global North, has become obsessed with what happens in the state and in the market, and I would argue neglects what's happening in the arena between the state and the market when we as individuals come together voluntarily to pursue the common good, to form organizations like yours to do wonderful things. And so civil society, that arena between the state, the family, the market in which people come together to do things, I think is incredibly important. And the first point I want to make is that we need to appreciate why that civil society is important to society and to humanity. Broadly speaking, there are three reasons. One, civil society gets things done. It fixes things. It fills gaps when other bits of society leave them. When a university decides to discontinue an international relations evening course, citizens step in and say, well, we can do this. A bunch of volunteers can organize 1,000 events over 45 years, purely through the power of voluntary spirit, filling a gap that the university or the state was unable to fill. When I walk around my neighborhood in South London, in Balham, I'm inspired by all the wonderful things that are going on in my community. On a Saturday morning on Wandsworth Common, we have Broomwood Football Club, Britain's largest entirely voluntary-run football club. It's something like 600 young people, mostly on a Saturday morning, crowd into Wandsworth Common, learn to play football, have a lot of fun. Parent coaches think that they can teach kids a thing or two about football. And it's an amazing thing. I walk a bit further down the street and, in a time of increasing need and increasing poverty, I'm inspired to see my neighbors come together to provide a food bank and a soup kitchen for people who can't afford to eat. I go to this repair cafe, and I don't know if you have one in this area, but a group of volunteers who say, well, actually, we might be consuming too much as society, and what we really should be doing is repairing things. And so these are volunteers once a month who in the church hall up the road gather to help people for free fix things that otherwise they would throw and it would go into landfill. And I don't know if you've been to one, but the most wonderful sound for me is that bell that rings when something's fixed. So I took in my daughter's backpack to be repaired. She wanted to throw it away, and I said, no, I think we can probably get this fixed. Someone helps to fix it. And when it's done, my daughter and the person go over to the corner, they pick up a bell, and they hit the bell. And to me, that's the wonderful sound of people power in action. So that's communities coming together to do stuff, to fix things. Civil society is also important because people power is about standing up to other forms of power. It's speaking truth to power. Civil society is part of political life, and throughout my career, whether I was working at Civicus, the Global Alliance for Civil Society, or even at Oxfam, working around the world, what I came to realize was that you can't have a functioning democracy unless you have a vibrant, thriving civil society. Unless we all, as citizens, can enjoy our freedoms to express ourselves, to assemble peacefully, to protest, to associate with each other in voluntary associations. And, the book is in one way just full of stories of amazing people I've either met or read about who have changed the world. I used to work in Johannesburg, about 200 meters from a mosque, where a young Indian lawyer, about 100 or so years before I lived in that bit of Johannesburg, ripped up his passbook because he said it was immoral for people of different races to have different types of passbooks. And it was his first act of civil disobedience. This was a rich Brahmin lawyer from India who was trained in the UK, had been sent to South Africa to be a trainee lawyer, and that young man was Mohandas Gandhi, later to be Mahatma Gandhi. His first act of civil disobedience that began him on a journey that led to Indian independence. Another young lawyer, Nelson Mandela, who also in Johannesburg begins his journey and with millions of others led to what I would argue was the most remarkable, or one of the most remarkable things in the 21st century, the peaceful transfer of power from the apartheid regime to the democratic regime through people power, through people coming together, not just in South Africa, but in places like this. Or a young woman in Saudi Arabia, Nasima al-Sadda, who I suspect many of you will not have heard, but when I worked at Civicus, we worked with her, this was about 15 years ago. She was a brave young woman who decided that it was wrong that women weren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. It was the last country in the world where women were not allowed to drive. And she said, that's not right. And so she used her legal skills to begin a campaign, took it through courts, and of course eventually Saudi Arabia authorities have now finally allowed women to drive. Or Mohammed Abdul Aziz, who you may remember, was the young man who in 2010 in a market outside Tunis set fire to himself because he was protesting corruption in the local authority. It began a revolution, the Tunisian revolution, that kicked off a series of revolutions in the 2010s across the Arab world. One other story that I thought I knew all about, which is of Rosa Parks, the young black seamstress who in her 40s in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to vacate her seat on the bus that was reserved for white passengers. When the bus driver told her to move to the back, she refused. She got arrested. She lost her job. Her husband lost his job. She took her case through the courts. What I didn't realize when I started to read about it was Rosa and her bravery is rightly something we should celebrate. But around Rosa were a whole range of other people who came together again to fight racism in America. It was the people who'd invited Rosa a few months before she was arrested to the Highlander Center, a folk high school just outside Montgomery, where for 2 weeks Rosa joined with lots of other people from different backgrounds, teachers, trade unionists, for the first time, she says in her autobiography, where she spent quality time with white Americans. And in that 2-week period, she learned about the importance of solidarity, of racial justice. She learned how to campaign and win things. Around Rosa were people who decided that to use her arrest to launch an economic campaign. They said, well, one way to change the system is to make it more difficult for the bus companies to make a profit. And so people said, well, how on earth are you going to do that? And they said, well, why don't we boycott the buses? And people said, what? How would you do? What power do we have? What would we do? And they said, well, we've got legs. Let's walk. And so for months and months and months, black Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, used their leg power to boycott buses, and other people, of course, who had cars, did carpooling and did all sorts of amazing things. And of course, while all this was happening, a young pastor who just graduated with his PhD had moved to Montgomery and become the local priest in the Southern Baptist Church. And he decided that this was actually something that needed to be elevated, that this wasn't just a fight about whether a woman has the right to sit where she wants in a bus, but actually it was about morality and humanity and what the American dream really was. And he started to make a series of powerful speeches and got into the national limelight, and that was, of course, a young Martin Luther King who was there on his first job. So you put all that together and you think, there's no way, if you're sitting there in 1955, that segregation in the deep South of America was ever going to end very soon. But you have a brave seamstress on a bus, some people who'd run a school, a trainee school for people to learn how to challenge and speak truth to power. You have an economic campaign where people thought they were powerless but ended up having power. And you add the amazing power of someone like Martin Luther King to inspire people. And you get, again, a remarkable demonstration of people power. And so the second function of civil society is to be a democratic force. And today we live in some really worrying times, which I'm going to get to, about the sort of state of democracy. And it feels like it's once again a time when we need to invest in the sort of democratic power and potential of us as citizens, and protect our freedoms to be able to speak out, to speak truth to power. So there's fixing things, there's fighting things, and there's a third function, which is really, I think, about fulfillment. And, I've knocked about in civil society, in the charity world, for almost all of my career. And it's only in the last few years that I think there's something even more fundamental about being a volunteer football coach or organizing weekly lectures in a university in Stoke-on-Trent. And that's about fulfillment. It's about putting our skills, our talents to use for the greater good. Not for personal enrichment, not because we have to, because we're compelled to do something, but because we want to contribute. And every single philosophical tradition that I have seen has some notion that humans can only find fulfillment through the deployment of their skills for the common good, to work with each other. We're social animals who find succor in being able to do things together with each other. Aristotle called it living eudaimonic lives. He distinguished between eudaimonic happiness, which is about that fulfillment, a higher purpose, and hedonic happiness, which is the sort of happiness we're bombarded with on TV, or worse still, if you doom scroll through social media. It's buy this, buy that, do this, be that. But eudaimonic happiness, fulfillment, is something different, and I would argue only comes through, or best comes through, voluntary action when we put our purpose to good use. And something that feels even more important today, given how rampant mental health challenges are, how lonely people feel, how strangely disconnected people feel, despite the power of the internet to connect us all. So amidst all of that, the idea that people can come together for common good, for common purpose, and put their talents to use, I think is really good. So point number one is civil society is important, and feels particularly important in this moment of human history where we need to fix lots of things that feel broken, we need to speak truth to power, and we need to nurture human flourishing at this moment. Point number two, though, is that civil society is under attack like never before. And this is some really worrying things that are going on all around the world, but particularly, or including, in the UK. If you look at those civic freedoms, the freedom to assemble, express yourself, to associate with others, almost in every part of the world, we're going backwards. Activists who dare speak truth to power are being killed. 100-odd environmentalists were killed last year, according to Global Witness. Several hundred journalists around the world were killed by people who wanted to silence them last year. Organizations are being clamped down on. Organizational life is being made more difficult. Let me give you an example that I write about that's known about in the public domain, but organizations in India, the world's largest democracy, or so we think, are under attack in ways like we've never seen before. Oxfam India, an amazing organization that had been in India doing humanitarian work since the 1960s, has had to sack something like 400 of its staff over the last few years because the Indian government has withdrawn the license for Oxfam and many other international organizations and domestic organizations from receiving funds from abroad, because these organizations are being accused of being traitors, of being foreign-funded agents undermining Indian democracy. And so they've had their lifeline of foreign funding cut. But then it gets worse. It's also involved, in the case of Oxfam India, a tax audit. So my former colleague was subject to a 2-day non-stop search of Oxfam India's office by the tax authorities who'd accused them of filing something in the wrong way. And so all of their computers and phones were cloned, and my colleague had to sit in the office on a camp bed that the authorities provided while all of this was being done. And around the world, in about 100 or so countries, we think, this sort of intimidation of organizations that dare speak out, that want to speak up for rights is happening. So whether you're an activist or an organization, you're under threat. But so too is peaceful protest. All around the world, we're seeing those who assemble peacefully to challenge those in power, or to challenge a corporate that wants to exploit a local resource, or to complain about a new development or a new dam, are being shut down, are being arrested, are being given severe sentences. And of course, It's happening here in the UK, I would argue, to a worrying level. Rebecca Solnit, who some of you will know is a fabulous author and columnist, has a book called Hope in the Dark. And she makes this wonderful point. She says, mainstream media suggests popular resistance is ridiculous, pointless, criminal, unless, of course, it's far away or long ago or ideally both. And so we love celebrating Mandela or Rosa Parks or all sorts of other people. Or historically, the suffragettes did a wonderful job in winning the right to vote for women. But today's protesters, well, they're very inconvenient and they're blocking our motorways and they're making attendance at the National Gallery just that more difficult for us. And that's worrying, because I would argue that how a society treats its dissenters, its peaceful dissenters, by the way, is a good test of how civilized that society is and how democratic it is. And I worry, if you look at what's happening, when at the time of the coronation of the king, you might remember there were protesters out in and around Westminster who were arrested simply holding placards against the monarchy. You might remember, you don't need to agree with the actions of Just Stop Oil, but the sorts of sentences that Just Stop Oil activists were given, far more than violent criminals, simply for peacefully protesting, I think, is a sign that we're heading in the wrong direction. Or just the criticisms made of those school children who dared to protest against climate change, if you remember a few years ago, in Fridays for the Future. Young people who said that they were worried about the state of the planet and their future, and who decided not to go to school on a Friday to make the point. If you read mainstream press, you'd think that these were somehow, traitors undermining our society and they should be going to school. These are all, we don't need to agree with all of the issues that people are mobilizing around, but I think it's really, really important that we defend their freedoms to do so, as long as they're peaceful and not intimidating others. And of course, that's what's happening to civil society, but if you go back to the argument I was making earlier about the importance of civic life to democracy, then I would argue that there's another dimension to that problem, which is that democracy itself is also under attack and in decline in ways that we might not have expected even a few years ago or a few decades ago. If you think about, let's take the UK, for example. 2/3 of us, in a recent poll, think that politicians are in it merely for themselves. Only 7% of us think that politicians act in the national interest. That figure used to be as high as 30-odd% when the Gallup organization polled in the 60s and 70s, and it keeps going down and down. At what point do we think there's a problem? Is it when only 1% of us think that our elected officials are acting in the national interest? Politicians are now less likely to be believed than real estate agents and bankers. It's not a good sign. Luckily, charity chief execs are about 50% likely to be believed. So I assume half of you will like what I say or agree with it. But there is a problem in terms of public trust in politics and public engagement, levels of voter apathy. 19 million of us chose not to vote in the last general election in the UK, far more than those of us who voted for the Labour Party. I want to pause and read a little bit from the book, if I may, because I was writing the preface to the paperback edition that just came out in February and March of this year. And I want to just give you a sense of why I'm worried about the state of civil society and the state of democracy. Perhaps the event that brought the concerns of the book into sharpest relief was the inauguration of President Trump on the 20th of January 2025. On the face of it, the 2024 US presidential election, in which 156 million people cast their vote freely for the candidate they thought would be best for America, should have been a celebration of the resilience of the American democracy. Yet, the 60th inauguration in the American Republic's life held on that freezing day in Washington, D.C., so cold that the ceremony had to be moved indoors to the Capitol Rotunda, sent shivers down my spine. After an election marred by bitterness and misinformation, a convicted felon who had supported, if not incited, the violent storming of that very Capitol building 4 years earlier, had campaigned to dismantle the checks and balances in American democracy, was being inaugurated as the President of the United States. Many of those who voted for Trump had done so to stick a collective middle finger up to what they saw as a dysfunctional democracy, a political mainstream they felt was betraying them, and to an economy that they felt was letting them down. They had elected a new president on the promise to tackle the sense of powerlessness felt by many Americans. As we gather today, Trump declared in his inauguration speech, our government I can't do a Trump accent, so our governments confront a crisis of trust. For many years, a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens, while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair, says Trump. I did a double take at this, for sitting right there in the rotunda behind Trump was the billionaires' row of tech broligarchs that included the three richest men in the US, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos. The crowd was also spattered with Europe's and India's richest man, Rupert Murdoch, worth only a mere $22 billion, but owner of a media empire that was critical to Trump's success, the CEO of controversial Chinese social media firm TikTok, even a Las Vegas casino magnate. All told, the billionaires in that room that day had a combined wealth of $1.35 trillion, not far off the combined wealth of the poorest half of all Americans in one room. Here in prime position were the very robber barons who were looting America and exerting corrosive, destabilizing pressure on the pillars of its democratic society, from capturing the free media and using a commitment to free speech to flood the zone with toxic misinformation, to dispensing with workers' rights and buying political influence. It is these people, if any, who have been extracting power and wealth from American society at an unprecedented rate. And they, including Trump himself, had just been given the green light to extract some more. Meanwhile, Trump has stayed true to his word, subverting the judiciary, pursuing vendettas against his political and media enemies, and breaking with democratic allies in Europe to align the US ever more closely with autocratic Russia. But this isn't all about Trump. If Kamala Harris had won in 2024, the political foundations of US democracy would still be fragile. Research shows that Americans are profoundly disillusioned with their nation's politics. In 1958, about 3/4 of Americans trusted the government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. Today, for Republican supporters, that stands at just 11%. At the beginning of 2024, almost 2/3 of Americans surveyed said they were mostly or always exhausted with politics, and 55% said they were often or mostly angry. When asked to identify a strength in the American political system, 56% gave no answer or said nothing, and 63% expressed not too much or zero confidence in the future of democracy in America. And while the US has certainly provided us with stunning example of democratic dangers we face, it is far from alone. 1 in 3 voters now lives in countries where the quality of elections has declined and election results are increasingly being disputed. Between 2020 and 2024, 1/5 of all election results face some form of challenge, and 1 in 5 elections saw the losing candidate publicly reject the outcome. Average electoral turnout has fallen globally from 65% to 55% in the last 10 years. Since 2020, incumbents have been removed in 41 of 55 democratic elections. Again, on the face of it, you might think this is a sign of a healthy democracy. I take a different view. For me, this is a sign of dissatisfaction with democracy itself. The drivers of this deep-seated frustration with the status quo are manifold, from inflation, rising prices, concerns around immigration, to the long-term economic, educational, and health repercussions of the COVID pandemic. In an age of worsening economic inequality, the creeping influence of billionaires in government and on electoral processes is engendering voter apathy from the US to Thailand to India. Social media is eroding people's trust in government, institutions, and each other. It is deepening political polarization, particularly around culture, identity, and the value of tradition in society, by fostering connections between people who consume similar content and relentlessly reinforcing particular worldviews. Its algorithms favor simple, emotionally charged messages, allowing conspiracy theories and fear-mongering to flourish, encouraging people to expect instant results and pushing them to judge quickly and harshly when they aren't delivered. The fact is that representative democracy in its current form is failing to provide people with what they want. A survey from 2024 across 31 countries found that 54% of adults were dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in their country. Many people feel disconnected from political leaders and institutions. Large majorities in many countries believe elected officials don't care. Many say there is no political party that represents their views. This is a problem we cannot ignore. And I say this because I think there is a direct link between people feeling disillusioned with democracy as we know it and what's happening in civil society. And the third and final point I want to make is that and this is a little bit of hope for any of you who's feeling particularly gloomy after those passages, is that we can help democracy or save democracy from itself if we put people back at the heart of both our politics and our economics. And so the first part of what I think needs to happen, and this is the majority of the book, is that democracy itself needs a sort of participatory makeover. Many of those institutions that we think are there to, and have been there forever are all relatively modern creations. The idea that we have two houses of parliament that work in this way, relatively recent. The fact that all of us can vote, relatively recent. And so why don't we innovate again? Why don't we add more deliberative mechanisms to the way that our democracy had worked? Many of you will have read about the Citizens' Assembly held in Ireland, most prominently about what to do about abortion rights. Some of you may have seen what happened in France when it came to the Citizens' Convention on climate change. These were deliberative mechanisms where ordinary citizens, selected by sortition, are invited in to advise policymakers about what to do about particularly thorny topics. And instead of elected officials shouting at each other from across the dispatch box, you have people coming together with very different views, but who are equal citizens, who spend time together listening to evidence, hearing from the experts, and deliberating about a sensible way forward. They might not always agree about everything, but all the evidence, and there's a group that's been looking at about 400 of these citizens' assemblies from around the world, suggests that they come to better decisions, that more people are bought into those decisions, and that those decisions tend to last longer than if politicians shout at each other, or when we have very reductive yes-no questions on referenda. Some of you might remember one a few years ago here that was like that. That's one example we could very easily do. We could, I would argue, take it one step further. Some of you may remember that the Labour Party in its election manifesto in 2024 promised to reform the House of Lords. Well, I'd urge Keir Starmer to go one step further. I know you've had lots of Lords or peers here. Now, they're all amazing people, but they're unelected, and they sit in the world's second largest legislative assembly, only behind the People's National Assembly in the People's Republic of China. 7% of them happen to be former party officials or donors. What sort of democracy puts donors to political parties in its upper house? Well, we could fix that by replacing the House of Lords with the House of the People. Why not have a house constituted, again, by sortitians, so that much like we're compelled to do jury service, if your name comes up for a period of years, for example, you're asked to sit in the House of the People, your job is kept for you by your employer if you're employed, you're paid a stipend, you're given some induction and training about what happens in a chamber like that. It might not do exactly the same job that the current House of Lords does. For example, it might not be a House of Review on every bill, or any bill. It might be that only when the Commons has a particularly thorny issue to debate. Assisted dying is a good recent example, that instead of the MPs debating it, they ask the House of People to consider the question and advise them on what to do. So at once you restore trust in democracy, I hope, through something like this. You lower the cost by getting rid of, I've lost count, 830, I think, peers at the moment. And you add a deliberative mechanism to our democracy. I would do the same, by the way, when it comes to the international system. I've spent a lot of my time in and around the United Nations. And if I have if you think democracy at the national level is not working well, there is no democracy at the intergovernmental level. It's one member, one vote. The votes happen not because of a political mandate from back home. The decisions are taken because of sort of horse trading between diplomats, saying, well, if you vote for this resolution of mine, I'll vote for that resolution of yours, and we'll do this, that. And there's no transparency, and there's certainly no democratic accountability. That can change. We could have, for example, when the next Secretary General of the UN is selected, instead of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council selecting them behind closed doors, why couldn't we have hustings globally? Even a vote, a public vote for the next Secretary General of the UN. Why couldn't we have an upper house of the United Nations that's similar to the House of the People proposal here, but an upper house in which a small number of us are selected, but through digital means meet to consider and deliberate using simultaneous translation, which is easier and cheaper than ever before, to deliberate the matters that, the things that matter to the world. So there are so many ways that we can modernize and update the way that democracy works, whether it's at the local level, at the national level, or at the international level, all of which put people and our voice back into decision-making in a far more creative, liquid, everyday way than the ways that democracy works today. And the second aspect of putting people back at the heart of life, and this relates to my day job at the New Economics Foundation, is to democratize our economies. The way that we've chosen to organize our economy is deeply problematic. We know it's problematic because of the impact that economic life is having on the planet and nature. We can't go on. Some of you may remember Kenneth Boulding saying that anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Now, I happen to be both, perhaps, but I don't, because we can't go on like this and assume that growth and consumption and greed, or what E.F. Schumacher called an economy built on an orgy of envy and a frenzy of greed, is deeply unsustainable. That's problem number one in the way that we've organized our economy. Problem number two is it's deeply unequal and getting worse at an eye-watering level. When I recall working for Oxfam, we did the inequality reports that you might see that happen get published every January around the time that Davos happens. And in 2014, when Oxfam first did that report, the calculation was that 64 people own the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. A couple of years later, that number went from 64 to 32 because those people had gotten richer, and 32. Then it went to 20-something, and then it's 8. I think it's 6 now. And soon, when Musk is a trillionaire, it might be one person owning more wealth than the entire half of the human population. And if you think, well, that's a global problem, it's not happening here. It is happening here. Average weekly earnings in this country have stagnated pretty much for the last 20 years. Meanwhile, if you happen to be in the top 1% of wealth holders, your real income has gone up, real wealth has increased by 31 times in the last 10 years because the asset prices have gone up, the property stock market has gone up, and so your income from wealth is going up, and we're sleepwalking into an inequality emergency. We are, I think, already the second most unequal country in the OECD behind the US. And we think of ourselves as a liberal social democracy, a Western European social democracy, but we're becoming very quickly like the US. Just quickly, how do we fix that? Again, just like you could innovate the way that democracy works, the answers to how we innovate the way that the economy works are also staring us in our face. The UK, for example, has been home to cooperatives and mutuals for at least 200 years. And already 3% of GDP in the UK is accounted for by the cooperative sector. Some of you will know the big ones like the Co-op Group or the John Lewis Partnership. Now, these are successful economic entities that aren't just about extracting profit and putting them into the hands of shareholders. They're about distributing power, about co-ownership. There are amazing employee-owned businesses. Wallace & Gromit, who many of you will know, is produced by Aardman Studios, where the three founders a few years ago, having worked to build up the business for decades, decided that they wanted to sell up. But instead of selling up to some American multinational, they sold their business to the employees. So something like 150 employees of Aardman Studios now own the business. And there are many hundreds of businesses these days that are becoming employee-owned. There are B corporations, there are mutuals that have been around, there are community energy companies, there are small-scale cooperatives happening in all sorts of sectors. And so if we put our mind to it, I'm convinced that we can reorganize and reimagine the way that democracy works so that we put people back at the heart of political life, and we can certainly and have to certainly reimagine the way that the economy works so that we put people back and reconnect us to economic life, to our productive life. And if we do those things, if we reimagine the way that democracy and the economy works, then I think we can put power back in the hands of people and make this the century of the citizen, which is what we need it to be. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for getting back so quickly. An engrossing Q&A is ahead of us. Two things. Dan Twitch will be here. For those of you who are steeped in your coffee, you'll have a further chance to meet Danny at the book desk at the end. And secondly, he's another speaker who's so impressed by you, he wants your permission to take a photograph of the audience. Is that anyone objecting? Could they please leave? Right. Go ahead.
Can we hold the books up as well?
You're very welcome to hold the book up if you happen to. And I am impressed, but I'm a little bit scared, Bill. I've never done this format where you have a signing before you have Q&A. And I've done Hay, I've done Edinburgh, right. I've done Glastonbury. I've never been as scared of a Q&A as I am tonight.
Try not to contradict anything in the book.
Oh, yeah. All right, here we go. Thank you very much.
Right. We're going to have to. We've got the microphones. I know there's one person who wants to ask a question, and I know what it's about, so we're going to include that. Anyone else, upstairs and down, show your hand and be persistent if you've got a really interesting question. But I'm going to start off with Brian Wilson's question. This is about citizens' assemblies versus politicians, and the way he puts it is, how would you propose to motivate politicians to engage more with their citizen assemblies and overcome their own fears of losing power? There must be some practical. Have you got any developed thoughts on that?
So I think if you were a member of the House of Commons, for example, a citizens' assembly gives you a route to avoid the sort of partisan adversarial debate that the Westminster system is known for. And if any of you listened to the assisted dying debate in the Commons, it was so unusual because the MPs weren't whipped along party lines, didn't shout at each other, felt considered and thoughtful and respectful of each other. And so I think one of the ways of convincing them is, okay, you've got your business to get on with in terms of debating the budget bill and this or that, but when it comes to these really difficult, thorny issues that are about ethics and values, then it will make your life easier if you were to give that sort of thorny issue to a group of people selected by sortition. And so, they did a good job, I think, or are doing a good job on assisted dying. But imagine if we had our time again, and instead of spending a lot of societal time shouting at each other about Brexit, for example, the referendum I was talking about earlier, imagine, we ended up after the Brexit referendum as a far more divided society because people were shouting at each other about this or that, and sometimes nothing to do with Brexit, but everything else got put into this very reductive debate in which we had two choices. And so I think the way to buy politicians in is to say, your life will be easier if you were to give some of these decisions over to a group of people who are then given the chance to deliberate and come to some sort of position. Now, as for members of the House of Lords, not many of them will be happy about a proposal to get rid of their position. I found that out telling a peer over dinner at the House of Lords dining room just the other day. She was very upset. She said, "How dare you say that? We bring a lot of value." And I said, "No doubt, she's a very impressive person, but is completely unelected, has no real public profile, no merit apart from the fact that she was nominated by her party leader to serve for the rest of her life as a legislator making decisions or reviewing them on our behalf." Doesn't really make sense.
As you've observed, quite a few House of Lords members have been to speak at World Affairs. One thing they commonly say is that we are good value for money, because it's relatively inexpensive, apparently. But I think your point is taken. I'd like to turn completely to the question of youth. You can see all this youth around in this theatre. So there are questions that are coming about that. I'm going to give you several unrelated questions, but they're all about young people, right?
Okay.
So see if you'd like to explore them. Anne Boulding, should the UK reduce the voting age to 16? Jenny Hartley, does training in citizenship and experience of citizens' assemblies have to begin in schools? Elizabeth Snow, how can we include the contribution from young citizens? How can these teens and early adults be heard and encouraged to wear fresh opinions and to innovate ideas? Because I suppose they will look at what's going on and think it's the older people, established people, who are making all the decisions. I mean, I don't know where they fit into your citizen assemblies, whether they've got time to attend. And I'm not sure where this question fits in. Bernadette saying, she's mentioning some stats about an average reading age of 9 in England and 7 in Stoke-on-Trent, near here. And so she's wondering what your views are on how the educational system could be made more fit for purpose to fulfill this idea of power to the people.
Gosh, that's only the
So
second to fifth questions.
Yeah, so talk about youth and where they fit into all of this. I'll retrace these questions if you need me to.
Okay, no, thank you. Well, I suppose a fundamental point I'd like to make is that for democracy to work, all of us as citizens need to exercise our rights and be free to do so, but also exercise our democratic responsibilities. So no theory of democracy works unless citizens exercise some degree of responsibility. Now, as you know, I grew up in Australia where voting is compulsory. It's wonderful. Seriously, we should think about it here. It reminds everyone that voting is not just a right that we happen to enjoy because others before us have fought and won that right, but because it's a responsibility for democracy to work. All of us have...
May I turn you around slightly towards the people on the left?
So all of us have a responsibility to do so, and voting is just the tip of the democratic iceberg. So I think that is important. I certainly support the right of 16-year-olds to vote, but that's the tip. If you go further down that sort of democratic iceberg, then we get into questions of active citizenship. I mean, what are the sorts of ways, what are the other ways in which one can exercise one's citizenship? And that's where I think the education curriculum is hugely important. We were having a discussion about it just at dinner. I know it is very difficult in a limited number of hours, in a relatively limited number of years, to pack all that we need young people to know. But the beautiful thing about citizenship education is it doesn't necessarily have to happen in the classroom, and indeed it might be better not to happen in the classroom. And so, my daughter, who's just about to take her A-levels, has been doing all sorts of wonderful things. Duke of Edinburgh. She's a volunteer, she was a volunteer at an Oxfam shop. She's been, teaching young people in her ballet school. All sorts of things that we've hopefully encouraged her to do, but have taught her about being an active member of her own community, have given her leadership skills and a whole range of other benefits. And we haven't really been investing in those. And I know you didn't ask about this, well, no one here asked about it, but you are a group of people interested in world affairs. I would say that's particularly important when it comes to global citizenship education. So when I started at Oxfam, I was told that at one point, Oxfam employed something like 30 people in the 1980s and 1990s, whose job it was to go to schools and universities and tell young people about the world and get them to think about the world outside the UK, to do what we call development education. By the time I'd started, almost that entire division didn't exist because the funding wasn't there, and the UK government and the Department for International Development slashed those budgets. And it's been happening in many parts of the sort of educational system where, and I know, Bill, you went on a voluntary service overseas, a VSO placement, very long time ago. But those sorts of things that opened one's horizons, that allowed people to think beyond sort of the 3 Rs and think about their role in the world and as citizens, we are under-investing in. And I think it's willful negligence, because what will come back are people who don't know how to express themselves as citizens, who feel distrustful of the system around them, who might retreat into a nationalism because they don't know about the rest of the world, and they think they do because they're on the internet, but actually they live a very parochial life. And so investing in young people is important. And one final point, I suppose, which is the point around involving young people in a more than tokenistic way. Throughout my career, I've seen these attempts by institutions of all sorts to engage stakeholders, and it might be young people, it might be local residents, but almost always the sort of engagement feels very tokenistic, very shallow, a little bit of an afterthought, a bit of window dressing. I often think they're not consultations, they're insultations, because they're just an institution going through the process of saying, yeah, we heard your voice, now we'll go and do the thing we were always going to do. And if that's how we treat young people in decision-making, we're also asking for trouble. And so the best resolution, and it's not just for young people, but for anyone, is to, if you're serious about engagement, meaningfully engage people in the actual decision-making. Share power. Be vulnerable and be open to being to letting them have a say and decide. And if we do that, we might actually see that the sort of answers that young people come up with are better suited for the rest of the 21st century than the sorts of answers that people in my generation might come up with. And so I think involving and engaging young people in meaningful ways is going to be really important.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about mandatory voting. You mentioned Australia, your adopted homeland, and Hazel wonders whether making it mandatory would encourage more people to become interested in what's happening in the country. And I think she's wondering whether you've got any comments about other countries. I mean, how widespread is mandatory voting, and what difference does it make to the addressing of issues?
So I think this is all on pages 242 to 246 of the book. No, I knew you'd look. But there is actually quite a section on voting, and particularly mandatory or compulsory voting. I think it's something like 18 countries have some form of mandatory voting for some elections. Australia is the one that's probably the most robust because at state and federal levels it's compulsory. But Belgium has, or certain bits of Belgian elections and others have done it. I think the evidence suggests there's a marginal return when it comes to political engagement, i.e. if you have compulsory voting, your citizens are a little bit more interested and engaged in politics than if you didn't. So that's not the payoff. I think the payoff is more about the sort of understanding of your role as a citizen. That this isn't just, an election isn't something you take lightly. You do, just on your way to the shops, and you just pick whichever box that you think takes your fancy. It's something more than that. So there's a sort of symbolism to compulsory voting that I think is hugely important. And I would say also, I know you didn't ask about this, but why on earth does Britain still keep the first past the post system?
We have got that question.
Oh, you do?
So
right.
do answer.
I'm glad you asked. Well, you were going to ask. But, again, it's there is no perfect electoral system. I'm not claiming that one is necessarily better than another. But I do think we're asking for trouble at the moment if we have the sort of disconfiguration of popular will that's happening at the moment in British general elections. So something like 427,000 of us voted for each Green MP that sits in the current House of Commons, whereas something like we only needed 27,000 of us to vote for each Labour MP that sat in the House of Commons. I live in the Tooting constituency in South London, which is a very safe Labour seat, once held by Sadiq Khan. I could vote for whoever. I could not even turn up, and the chances are Labour will win that seat. It's not particularly interesting. So, again, coming back to the sort of, if you couple compulsory voting with a more a system, and there's no one perfect system, but a system that at least lets you express your preferences in a more intentional way, and you think my vote might actually count, then I think we're going to have a greater chance of engaging people in politics. So it's not necessarily just mandatory voting. It might be the coupling of it with alternative or single transferable systems that will help. And if you want a good example, so in New South Wales, the state in which Sydney is and where I grew up, for a moment in the 1990s, for upper house elections in the state legislature, you could vote above the line, which means so there was a upper house, and you could say, well, the party that I want to vote for is this, and you could put an X. So if you wanted to vote for the Green Party, you put an X, and then they would distribute your preferences along a published system. So before the polling starts, the Labour Party or the Green Party or the Liberal Party or whatever would say, if you vote for us, we will distribute your vote along these preferences, and it's published. But if you were a political geek, you could vote below the line, which means you had to vote for all of the candidates in rank order, and if you didn't vote for all of them, then the vote would be null. So I have never felt more democratic joy than putting 142 next to the 142nd candidate, who I really despised. And you think to yourself, so you can even make politics and voting much more fun and interesting. Now, not many people did that, and they did change the system later to make it so that you didn't have to vote for all 142 candidates. You could stop when you exhausted your sentiment or your passion. But, how much more fun would that be than a little X?
I remember a book from years and years ago, and I can't find it on the shelf. I want to reread it, called The Rise of the Meritocracy. I don't know how many other people have read that. I think he was a Labour peer, Michael Young? Wonderful book, and of course the meritocrats are elected in this wonderful system, but in the end, the rest of the population get fed up with them, and it ends up in civil war. And guess who lost? So this question from Tony MacDonald sort of fits in with what you're talking about, where I think you portrayed it, not the meritocrats running things and the citizens being ignored, but more the uber rich controlling things. So he's saying, you imply that our democracy needs to change. That is surely from the point of view of those of us at the bottom. Those at the top, the ruling elite, won't allow that change to take place. So what are your thoughts on how to bring about meaningful change which doesn't involve violence but really makes a difference and shifts things? How would you get implementation, some of the ideas you've discussed tonight?
Right. Thank you. So on meritocracy and or social mobility, as it's sometimes called, maybe can I ask the audience a question, Bill? How many of you think that social mobility, the idea that you can get ahead through your talents, is increasing in the UK, i.e. it's more likely that you can get ahead if you have the talent and work hard and have the qualifications versus getting worse? Who thinks it's getting better in the UK? Who thinks it's getting worse? Right, well...
3-1.
Almost every study I've read suggests that we are actually, again, sleepwalking into a crisis of social mobility. It certainly was the case that we had a remarkable period in this country from the end of the Second World War till the 1990s, where we had high and surprisingly high degrees of social mobility. If you went to school or university or got a qualification or a trade, you were able to have opportunities that your parents and grandparents didn't happen. All of those trends are going backwards at an unprecedented rate. Read a Sutton Trust report published earlier this year that suggests we now have the lowest levels of social mobility of any country in the OECD except for the United States. So you might have talent, you might work hard, but the chances are you're not going to get ahead or do better than expected because of the opportunities. And the reasons for that are manifold. The state that should be there to provide you with those opportunities is being pared back. The concentration of wealth and capital in the hands of fewer and fewer means that you can't break in. And even the concentration of capital, why wealth accumulation matters even for capitalism. I mean, you can be a free marketer and hate this level of inequality because the more concentrated wealth becomes, the higher the threshold is to break into a market. So, if you run a small business or a startup, the chance of you cracking into the digital economy when it's run by the Amazons and the Googles and the Metas of the world, is incredibly difficult, or more likely they'll just buy you out the moment you start to threaten them. So gone are the days, even in the sort of, if you buy the sort of market ideology, that the market is particularly good at the moment of allowing people to get a breakthrough. So I do think there's a sort of crisis of when it comes to meritocracy, and it's seen in what's happening around inequality. If you looked at the last Sunday Times Rich List, I did a Guardian op-ed about this a few months ago, it's really curious. At least a third of the households listed in this year's Sunday Times Rich List have inherited wealth, and many of them have generations of inherited wealth. Another third have wealth that's created through some form of quasi-monopoly or extraction. They've had a lucky break, they've got into a market or a segment that they've managed to control and stop others from coming in, and they're rent-seeking, if that makes sense. And then a third are the sort of people who've got ahead because they've really worked hard and they've got up, come up with a great idea or a lucky break. So again, if you think, well, we need inequality in society because you need to have a reward to work hard and get by, it's not happening when it comes to social mobility, and it doesn't seem to be happening at the upper end of the distribution curve. And so something needs to give. And I suppose that raises the question, well, what's going to change? Or what will help bring about change? One thing that's going to bring about change is that lots of rich people, or the super rich as they're often called, are getting it, that this is not sustainable. If you want a fantastic read read a report from many years ago by a group called Patriotic Millionaires, who are a group of rich people, first in America, who wrote a fantastic report called Taxes, Not Pitchforks. And the group are very well off, and they're saying, there's a problem. We've become really well off because we're lucky, or we found a gap in the system, or we've got a sector that's not regulated. But if you don't tax us, the social fabric is going to tear apart, and we'll have disintegration. And we've been doing some work interviewing rich people. In fact, earlier this year, colleagues and I interviewed 30 really rich people, including some billionaires, and asked them, do you think there's a point at which you can have too much? Turns out, most of them do. They think that, I don't need all of this extra wealth, and in fact, it's a problem trying to get rid of it through philanthropy, and my kids want more of it, and there's a point. And so I think part of the change will happen from very rich people getting, understanding that actually there's a problem here. Part of it is challenging the orthodoxy amongst mainstream politicians in particular, that accumulation is a necessary and inevitable and uncontrollable aspect of human life or modern capitalism. It's not, right? Why do we not have an extreme wealth line? We have an extreme poverty line. So we have a line, we have several lines in fact, where we say no one in British society should have to live with an income below the line that because that's the money you need to just survive in our society. Well, why wouldn't we have an extreme wealth line where we say, actually, as a society, we think once you have £10 million of personal wealth, £100 million of personal wealth, I don't know what that line is, you either have to give it away before you die, or the government will tax it, or some other device to make sure that wealth is not accumulated in greater amounts, and that you don't then pass it on so that it worsens inequality. And so that we literally do have a campaign to create an extreme wealth line, and we're trying to convince policymakers that this is the sort of thing that will help them at least give some constraints to unlimited accumulation. So, we need to get buy-in from rich people. We need to convince our policymakers that they can do something about wealth inequality. And the very last thing is the fear that the reminder that we have to make that this is unsustainable. Every other society in human history where inequality has run rampant, where the feudal overlords, or the monarchs, or the emperors, or the kings, or the queens, or the pharaohs have hoarded wealth and prevented the rest of society from the opportunity to get ahead. What's happened to those societies? They all collapsed. Every single one of them. And if you want proof, read a fantastic 580-page book out by a guy called Luke Kemp. Maybe you could get him to come and speak here. Just out, called Goliath's Curse. And Luke has gone through 10,000 years of human history and plotted every time a society or a system collapses, and his argument is the main reason for that collapse is greed. That some people said they can just take it all and take more and more, and before they knew it, societies collapsed because people wouldn't put up with it, and they fought them and they burnt it all down. And I think that's the third thing, is we have to just say, if we want to protect this sort of way of life and stability and peace as we know it, we have to do something about inequality.
We've got a question on the front row on the subject of broadly capitalism, so let's hear that question.
Thank you, Danny. At the end of your speech, you mentioned the 3%, I think, of cooperative-owned companies, and it's in the book, page 147, something similar. Members here who are local will know just across the main road, often advertised, is the Best British Beer Company, which a couple of years ago, Will and his wife gave 51% of the shares to the employees. Forklift driver, the packers, the girls that do the labelling and processing. How would you encourage more businesses to follow in that way?
It's a great question. I hadn't heard about the best. Is it literally called the Best British Beer? Oh, right. Is it warm? Right, okay. Yeah, because sometimes that's a contradiction in term. Warm British beer is not best.
Tastes good.
So I think, the employee-owned business structure that I was talking about earlier, like Aardman Studios and others, that happens when the founders want to sort of sell out of the business, and they say, well, instead of selling it to private equity or listing it, I'll sell it to my employees. Just on that, that's really important to note, because another way that 20th century capitalism created opportunity, or the shareholder democracy that Margaret Thatcher told us about, was that when a business got to a certain size, for most of the 20th century in countries like the UK and the US, they got listed on the stock exchange. People said, we'll go public. We'll sell shares and we'll get the capital. We'll cash out if we want that way, and then everyone can own it. We have now had historically low levels of public listing of companies, both here in the UK and the US, because what's happening to companies when they get to a certain size, they get bought out by the bigger competitor or a hedge fund, or they're taken private in some other way. So we're not getting the sort of public listing. So one thing we do have to think about is ownership structures and convincing more and more people who want to sell up their businesses that it's better to plow that capital back into the people that we are. The second thing is around the nature of work. The way that 20th century economic development has worked across the world is pretty simple, really. We basically said, we took informal activities that people were doing, farming or local activities. We formalized it. We called it work. We regulated it. We taxed it. Women came into the workforce, and so we had more workers. We created employment. That meant that people had more money in their pockets. They could save and do stuff and have holidays and all that wonderful stuff. In that process, governments were able to tax. And so we created the modern welfare state. We were able to educate people, train people, create the National Health Service. And we created the modern welfare state. Again, a remarkable human creation, right? To think that actually we'll tax each other and provide a safety net for each other. And whenever you need it, you'll get free healthcare at the point of delivery. An amazing concept. Almost certainly, that's not going to be sustainable for much longer. And you might even argue it's starting now. Because we're almost at sort of saturation point at the way of workers, because we've got most people working or having to work, or we've got the sorts of jobs that are being created, or the sort of industries that are dynamic are not particularly labor-intensive or work-intensive. So the idea that you can work for 40 hours or work 2 jobs or whatever, there might not be those sorts of jobs, and therefore there might not be those taxes that are going to be generated from work, income taxes, national insurance contributions. You might even not have as much money, so therefore you're not consuming as much, you're not generating as much value-added tax. And so the state is going to be starved of resources, which is why poor Rachel Reeves is having to consider all those difficult choices she'll inevitably have to make in just under 2 weeks' time. And so I'm going to get to your answer. You have a system that's unsustainable. Well, how might we fix that? Well, maybe we go back to local. And we say, actually, we go back to an idea that value and production and even consumption might happen more at the local level. That you have the everyday economy, as some economists call it, that it needs to thrive. You can back it with digital systems, and you might still have global trade, and things do move, but value is created locally. And one way to do that is also to give people, to stop making them think they're just workers in a long and multinational value chain, but actually you're saying, well, it's work, the boundaries between work, community, citizenship starts to blur, and we start to live more like we probably live for most of human history, which is you're contributing and taking out of a system in more dynamic and interesting ways. And a fabulous example in the digital world that I love is, which I talk about in the book, I don't know what page it is, but you'll tell me, is a platform called Good for Trust, which is a Turkish equivalent of Amazon. Right? So the world's biggest online platform, Amazon, is owned by some shareholders who are getting ridiculously rich. In Good for Trust, it's owned by everyone on the platform. So it's just like a digital platform. You can go and buy stuff, you can sell stuff if you're a trader, but everyone who participates in the platform owns it, so it's a digital cooperative platform. And that people who are buying and selling aren't just sort of nameless, faceless people that you buy from or sell to. the algorithm and the communications platforms are being used so that you can interact. So if you're a farmer growing vegetables, the people who bought from you last season can help tell you what they liked, what they think you should grow this year, what varieties you might want to invest in. And so everyone on that platform is not called a consumer or a producer, they're called prosumers, because they're saying, well, you need to blur these boundaries between who's doing what. So even this nature of working for the man, just going in, clocking out, was not particularly satisfying for anyone who's done it. And it need not be the future, and we could reimagine the nature of work. I know it's very unsettling, but if we do something like that, then I think we can salvage a sense of sort of hope for a lot of people who think, where are the jobs going to be in the future once the machines take over? How am I going to earn a living? How am I going to pay the taxes needed to support the welfare state?
I'm going to turn back to volunteering. Just an observation. Christine Powis observes that volunteering has become the privilege of the older people, as young families seem to have less time and money to participate. But Ian Watson is really asking about this sort of tension between government provision and the voluntary sector. Should citizen charities fill all the gaps that governments leave, or do politicians not have responsibilities to serve all their citizens too? So how do you strike a balance in creating a fair and good and effective society, the balance between what comes from the public purse and what comes from people like us?
So just on the volunteering question, that is a challenge, that there are lots of people who are time rich and lots of people who are time poor, and particularly in an unequal economy where you're going, and the sort of gig economy that's emerging, you have to work all sorts of hours all the time, and so just so busy making ends meet that then finding the time for enrichment and to do volunteering and all of that is incredibly difficult. That said, again, when I worked for Oxfam, one of the amazing things was our volunteer network. Something like 20,000 people in the UK volunteer at Oxfam mostly through the shops. And I used to go and do volunteering, once alongside my daughter until she kicked me out. It's so fabulous because you can get people from all walks of life, including people who are struggling to get by but who want to give back, or even people who say, well, I'm struggling to get a job, but by volunteering I'm getting the confidence, the skills, the networks to be able to be more employable. So we do need to sort of level the playing field, but actually the playing field might also change so that if we're sort of changing the sort of work leisure equation a little bit in years to come, we might find that people have more time on their hands. So the New Economics Foundation is a 4-day-a-week employer. I don't know if you've known about the 4-day-week campaign. So just before I started, they moved to a 32-hour contract with no loss of income. And so I have Fridays off, which is amazing, but I get paid the same amount. And so do all of my colleagues. Excuse me. So I think that equation is changing. Ian's question around gaps. I think I have a contradictory answer. We have at once to make sure that the state plays its role. Because, as I said, some of the most remarkable achievements of this society happened because we invested in a state, an interventionist state that provided the public services we needed to get ahead, to invest in the right things, to discipline capital, to discipline the excesses of markets. And so we can't afford to let the state withdraw from providing those essential things and just assume that the big society, as David Cameron used to call it, will somehow step in and all of us will voluntarily provide the sort of health care and education and social services that the state would have once expected to do. So that's important, but I'm going to say something contradictory. You might also assume, though, that we're never going to see a state as big as we currently have. So the state at the moment in Britain is about 40% of GDP, i.e. 4 in every 10 pounds that circulates in the economy, or not circulates, but is accounted for in the economy in any given year, is somehow associated with the state. And that's because we've been able to collect taxes through work and consumption. But you might say, well, actually, that equation's going to change, and the state might only be 20% or 30%. Of GDP in the next few decades. And so therefore, the sorts of things we expect of the state might be unsustainable, And therefore, we need to be thinking about how can voluntary organizations or charities step in to do some of those things. And I think we need to prepare for that. And again, right back to where I started from, I still think, that's where you all, we all, and the sorts of things you're doing are incredibly important, because at some point there are going to be places, areas, services in which the state is just unable to do very much. The gaps are going to open up, and we're going to have to find creative, communitarian answers to some of those challenges, rather than a statist answer to some of those challenges. So if you would tolerate it, we need to save the state, but we need to prepare for perhaps its inevitable decline.
By the way, the director of the Government Statistical Service came to give a talk at Keele, not at Keele World Affairs, a few years back, and I challenged him because he was very complacent about how brilliantly they measure GDP. We can point out that all this volunteering that we're talking about is not measured.
Yeah.
And as I pointed out to him, they had just changed the statistical system across Europe in order to include drug dealers and prostitution. But they weren't including volunteering. And how did that measure? So was GDP actually measuring a healthy society?
It is.
He didn't have an answer, by the way.
Well, Simon Kuznets is often credited with creating the notion of GDP, never intended it to be used in the way we currently do. That's just the crazy thing. I mean, I could pay you, Bill, to go and break that door, and then I could pay someone else to fix it, or the university, presumably, will pay someone else to fix it. GDP will have increased by the amount I paid you and what the university paid, but welfare will have been decreased. And yet we think this is the best we can do to capture and evaluate human flourishing or human welfare. It's crazy. Have a look at the Happy Planet Index, which is my colleagues at NEF about 10 years ago came up with a very cool way of measuring human happiness. And there are lots of other fantastic initiatives as well. But we can do better than GDP.
We're running out of time. We've got a few thoughts about countries outside the UK. Just a few one-liners from you. Martin Drew mistakenly thinks your home country is Sri Lanka, but of course you left there quite young, didn't you?
Yeah, but I'm Sri Lankan, Australian, British.
Right, okay.
Married to a
he wonders
Trinidadian.
how much traction Power to the People would gain in Sri Lanka.
Yep.
And Pauline Medovnikov is concerned about what's happening in Tanzania, citizens protesting against a fraudulent election. And I think also Chris Nibbs, he said you fated the smooth transfer of power in South Africa. That's fine, but he thinks it's gone downhill. How can its governance recover? So you can't cover all of that in depth, but would you like to give some general thoughts about how power to the people can be exercised outside the UK and many of these countries?
I should have expected from an audience interested in world affairs I'd get questions about Sri Lanka, Tanzania, South Africa. Well, I would add Madagascar and Nepal to that list of places that I've been sort of paying attention to recently, where we are seeing across the world a very similar phenomenon, which is people are not happy with the way that government, politicians are working, and they're rising up, and particularly younger folk, as we've seen in many parts of the world. And so, the book is my editor was very clear that he wanted me to write a book for the UK primarily, but I've tried to sneak in as much international anecdotes and experience, because I do think there's something global going on, and not surprising given that what we're talking about are some universal issues about the sort of democratic institutions that we built and in some cases exported to other parts of the world that aren't working as well as they should. Plus people are seeing what's happening around the world, and so there is a lot of commonality. And I don't think we can't put the participation genie back in the bottle. We can't say to people, well, yeah, you've all, we've arrived at democracy, you've got the internet, you should have all of these freedoms, but actually, sorry, we didn't really mean it. Go back to being sort of very passive subjects and listen to what we say. So we have to lean into this phenomenon. I do think there's a sort of tipping point, if you will, globally, about what happens to democracy. Does it really retreat into an ugly and scary set of autocracies, retreat into nationalism, retreat into global wars again? Or do we salvage it and say what we're going to do, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Tanzania or Madagascar or Nepal, do we revitalize it and make it more democratic? And that's where South Africa is a really good example. I lived in South Africa for 3 years, and when I arrived in the early 2010s, I was really excited because I thought, wow, I'd read about this country, I'd gone on protest marches about this country. This is going to be a vibrant democracy and a thriving one, but actually, sadly, in many ways, South Africa has gone backwards since 1994 in terms of what's happened to the corruption, what's happened to the state apparatus, that what was an amazing demonstration of people power has become, in some ways, a sort of corrupted state that's become self-serving, and that's not very sustainable. Now, you might say, well, then doesn't that make my argument naive that you have this sort of delivery of people power, and then the empire strikes back, and politicians start to line their pockets? And well, my counter-argument to your counter-argument, if you're making it, is that we can but try, right? What's the alternative? That we just let this happen, that these systems just become self-serving and corrupt and out of touch and distrusted? Well, I think the lesson globally is we need to push back and reimagine and cede power to more people.
I'm going to finish in two areas. Alistair Duncan, slightly tongue-in-cheek, likes your proposed solution for a reformed House of Lords. He says it should be populated by the members of Keele World Affairs in order to introduce sanity. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but would you like to say just a little bit more about how that sortition, as you described it, maybe a word that people aren't that familiar with, how that can be made practically effective so that it's truly representative and seen to be and accepted as fair by society as a whole? Has any thought been given to that process?
Yeah, the good news is lots of thought has been put into that process, and there's been quite a bit of experience. So as I said, 400-odd different experiments with large-scale citizens' assembly. The German-speaking region of Belgium actually has a permanent citizens' assembly, much like what I'm suggesting for the House of the People. And so there's even a little experiment, albeit in a small part of a small country, to do this. And so sortition, for those of you who don't know it, is effectively a sort of system of random selection, but with a view to be representativeness, if that makes sense. So that you say, well, if you wanted 99 people in a citizens' assembly, how would you choose them? Well, you'd look at the electoral roll, and so you've got your universe of people. You'd pick, you'd pick 99 people, but you'd make sure that those 99 are representative of broad categories, so they're gender balanced, or they are found from the right geographical distribution across the UK. And so that's how you'd get a representativeness into the system. And, it might think, well, how on earth would a House of the People work? So I haven't thought too much about this, but, the way I would imagine it working would be, like you're called for jury service, you'd get a letter, and the letter would say, you've been, by sortition, you've been selected to serve in the House of the People. It's probably a 2-year or 3-year term, because there's a lot to learn, and you might not get to sit until you've been through some sort of induction and training program. And you do that, you're not sitting every day, all day, and certainly, because if this is a house that only considers the sort of the big, thorny societal issues, you might only sit, 1 month every quarter, for example. And so, that month in the quarter, you go, if it's going to be somewhere, I wouldn't put it in Westminster, maybe Stoke-on-Trent would be a good place to put it. And you'd all take the train up to Stoke-on-Trent for the month, and you'd spend the time deliberating and coming up with the decision on the issue that you're considering. I don't think that's particularly difficult to imagine. It certainly wouldn't be that costly. And imagine the payoff that we sort of revitalize our democracy, and we say we don't actually want an unelected upper house. We trust each other to come up with sensible decisions about the sorts of things that we care about. And the fascinating thing about the research of these citizens' assemblies is that they tend to reach conclusions in a rather unexpected way and in an unexpectedly cohesive way. So one of my favorite ones is in Texas, they did a citizens' assembly about taxing petrol. So you think, Texas, petrol, who's going to be up for that? So they put 99 people in a room for a few weeks, I think, and gave them the question of what should we do about fossil fuel subsidies? And going into the room, people said, this is not going to work. These are randomly selected Texans, and given the evidence and having the chance to deliberate and debate with each other, they came up with a set of proposals far more ambitious than the Texan government or the American government was willing to go. And the same thing, there was an amazing example of global assemblies on climate change that happened. I think it was one day in 2015 in something like 76 countries. On the same day, groups of people met and deliberated using the same methodology. And they, on the whole, came up with a far more ambitious program about reaching net zero or climate action than our member states or the governments were willing to do, and far more likely to say, yes, we all need to make some sacrifices to achieve a more sustainable future than the politicians were able to do when they were horse trading, of course being lobbied by the fossil fuel industry while they're doing that. So there's not only lots of thought, but even a lot of practice, I think, at doing these sorts of mechanisms. And I, for one, was really hopeful that when Keir Starmer said, well before the election, that it's time, the time for the House of Lords has come and we're going to do something about it. But last I was heard, they've not only done nothing about it so far, they're not planning to do anything for the rest of this parliamentary term about it as well.
And you've not been asked to join it?
I'm still waiting for that opportunity to say politely decline.
I'm going to finish on one question, which is a little bit predictable. You've met around 350 citizen members, and so Alan Clayton ends the evening with you asking you in a quick few words, say, what can the individual citizen do to make a real difference?
Read my book. No, I mean the wonderful thing is anything, everything. It could be as small as volunteering in a World Affairs organization. It could be as large as, gluing yourself to a petroleum factory. It could be just going out to speak to young people about the importance of being a citizen. It could be talking to your MP and saying, why aren't you doing something about making democracy more liquid and everyday? I mean, there are endless ways in which we can step into that role of citizenship. And, if that's the one lesson I hope you take away from this, is that it's a sort of willful negligence by lots of people and actors in society of the importance of active citizenship. And I fear that whether it's the way that democracy works or the way that economy works or the way that the global governance works, is that we are going backwards because we haven't invested enough on that notion of citizenship. And it starts with each of us.
The final commercial this evening is, of course, that if you'd like Danny's signature on his book, he'll be with the Nantwich book desk as you leave. I'm sure that you've had a lot of food for thought tonight. It has been a very thought-provoking evening, and I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Danny Sriskandarajah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Do come again.
Thank you.